This widow's unbelievable faith made Jesus stop and speak. Come close, and let me tell you a story about a woman whose life mirrored the very dust of the road she walked. She lived in a small, arid town called Zarephath. The world knew her simply as a widow, a title that carried with it a quiet, devastating finality. A widow in her time was a person without an anchor. Her identity, her security, and her hope were tied to a man who was no longer there. His passing had left her with a gnawing emptiness, a silence in the home that had once been filled with laughter and his presence. Now it was just her and her young son, and the ever-present shadow of scarcity. The relentless, biting hunger had become a companion. Every day was a fight against a quiet desperation that gnawed at her spirit and her strength. She watched her son's face, his eyes full of a childish hope that she could no longer muster, and the sight of his innocence was a dagger in her heart. She was a woman reduced to her most basic elements, a mother fighting for the life of her child. The very air she breathed seemed to be full of the quiet dread that tomorrow would be harder than today. You know this feeling, don't you? That knot in the pit of your stomach when you check your bank account, that silent anxiety when you look at the bills piling up, that fear that your best efforts are not enough to protect those you love. That was her reality, multiplied by the unforgiving nature of a great famine that had gripped the land. This famine was more than just a lack of rain. It was a spiritual desolation. The skies were like brass, and the ground was cracked and hard, mirroring the hearts of a people who had forgotten their God. In this world of despair, her life was a testament to endurance, a grim routine of survival. She would rise, sweep the floor, and look into the jars in her small kitchen. The jar of flour was almost always empty, a ghostly reminder of meals long gone. The jug of oil was so light she could hold it with a single finger, a vessel of vanished blessings. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and worn, a record of a life spent scraping for what little was left. Her purpose had narrowed to a single relentless mission: keep her son alive for one more day. Her days were a blur of small, heartbreaking calculations. How to make a single piece of wood burn longer, how to make the last drops of water last one more hour, how to make a little last just a little bit longer. Her mind was a fortress of survival, but the walls were crumbling. The silence in her home was not peaceful. It was a scream of what was absent. Her spirit was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond a lack of sleep. She was living a life that was slowly, painfully, and deliberately ending. But there was no escape from the finality of their situation. The resources were gone. The end was no longer a vague fear. It was a certainty. She had scraped the bottom of the jar for the very last bit of flour. She had shaken the jug until the final drop of oil had trickled out. There was nothing more. The time had come to face the inevitable. Her plan was as simple as it was devastating. She would take that last handful of flour and that last drop of oil, mix them together, and bake a small cake. She and her son would eat it, and then, in her own words, they would die. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a statement of fact, a heartbreaking admission of surrender. Her faith, if she had any left, had withered under the relentless sun of her circumstances. Her hope had been a seed planted in hard, cracked ground, and it had failed to sprout. She was not a woman of great faith, but a woman of great sorrow. She was not asking for a miracle, for she had stopped believing in them. She was simply stating the end of her story. Her trust in the world, in her own ability, and in God had reached its final, painful conclusion. The quiet resignation in her voice was a louder plea than any scream. She had arrived at the cold, hard conclusion that her struggle was over, and there was nothing left to do but accept the outcome. The wind was hot and dry, carrying only the scent of dust and the faint memory of a rain that had not fallen in years. She walked toward the city gate, a bundle of sticks in her arms, her mind occupied with one final task. She was gathering the wood to build a fire, the one that would bake their last meal. This was the final ritual of her life, a final act of a loving mother providing for her child. Her path was a straight line toward a devastating conclusion. But as she bent to pick up a stick, a voice cut through the silence of her despair. It wasn't a loud voice, not a booming command from the heavens. It was a simple, direct request from a stranger. "Please bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink." This was the crack, a small, seemingly insignificant interruption in the final moments of her ordinary, devastating story. A simple request for water. It was a moment of novelty, a change in the relentless rhythm of her life. She was a woman on a mission of quiet desperation, and this man, this prophet named Elijah, had just asked her for a favor. He was not a king, not a priest, but a man of the desert, a stranger whose eyes held a depth she could not fathom. She looked at him, and perhaps for the first time in a long time, she was forced to look away from her own sorrow, her own single-minded focus on the end. It was an invitation to pause, to acknowledge another person's presence in her solitary world. She turned to go and get the water, a simple act of human kindness, born from a heart that was still somehow capable of it. She walked a few paces, the thought of his simple need a momentary distraction from her immense grief. But as she walked away, he called to her again. This time his request was not simple, it was audacious. "Please bring me a piece of bread." This was a moment of profound surprise, a direct challenge to the very foundation of her reality. Bread. She had just told you her story, my beloved. She had just shared her devastating secret with the very dust of the road. She had no bread. This man was asking her for the impossible, for something that did not exist in her world. Her heart, already so full of sorrow, must have felt a new sting, a sting of cruel irony, of a request that seemed to mock her utter lack. The audacity of it must have felt like a cruel joke, a cruel twist of fate that made her misery a public spectacle. The silent grief of her heart was suddenly being demanded of her, as if her pain were his personal request. She stopped and turned back to him, her voice trembling not with anger, but with a raw, painful truth. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, her words a testimony to the emptiness of her faith. "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her statement was not a refusal, it was a declaration. It was her final, heartbreaking confession. The crack had widened into a chasm. This prophet had not only interrupted her walk, but he had opened the door to the truth she had been living with in silence. And in that moment, the seemingly insignificant request for bread became the most important question of her life. She laid bare her soul, presenting her unshakable, devastating reality to a man she did not know. Her words were a shield and a weapon, a desperate attempt to protect herself from any further hurt or false hope. This was the moment of complete transparency, where there was nothing left to hide. The words hung in the air, a final, painful admission of her hopelessness, that we may eat it and die. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, on the last few sticks she had gathered, a grim preparation for a final act. She had presented her case, her unshakable logic, the crushing reality of her circumstances. This was her truth, and she was a woman of her word. The end was a certainty, a conclusion she had accepted with a heavy heart. But the prophet's voice, full of an authority she had never heard before, cut through the noise of her despair. "Don't be afraid," he said. And then he made the most radical, illogical request of all. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." This was the breaking point. the moment where her weary, logical and resigned mind collided with a promise that seemed to defy all natural law. The conflict was immense, an internal war between reason and a flicker of hope. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to refuse. "He's a madman! My son will starve! This is all we have left!" The urgency of her situation was a loud, desperate voice in her mind, a frantic protector of her last meal. She had held on to her last bit of flour and oil with a fierce, possessive love, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. And now, a stranger was asking her to give it all away, to surrender her last shred of control. Her hands must have clenched into fists, the sticks digging into her palms. She stood at a crossroads where her old life and a new, terrifying possibility could no longer coexist. She could have chosen to walk away, to ignore this impossible request, to hold on to the last vestiges of her pride and her own strength. But the prophet's words carried a weight that was not of this world. He followed his command with a promise. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." This was the authority of God speaking through a man, a promise that demanded a choice. Would she trust her senses and the reality of the famine, or would she trust a promise that seemed to mock all reason? The weight of this decision was immense, a burden far heavier than any of her daily chores. The choice was not between two options, but between two entire world views. One was the world she knew, a world of lack and sorrow. The other was a world she could not see, a world of divine provision that defied all logic. It was a moment where her despair was placed on a scale against my promise, and she had to choose which one held more weight. The mental battle was fierce. She had to decide whether to live by sight or by faith, to choose between her own desperate planning and my boundless provision. The weight of this decision was immense, a burden far heavier than any of her daily chores. It was a test of the heart, a crisis that revealed the true nature of her spirit. And in that moment of profound desperation, with no logical reason to believe, she made the most radical, powerful decision of her life. She chose to trust. She chose to give her very last meal away. It was a surrender not of her resources, but of her fear, of her need for control, and of her desperate, heartbreaking plan to die. She was not a woman of great faith, but in that moment she performed a great act of faith. She took the ultimate risk, and in that surrender, the impossible became her reality. Her heart, once broken and closed, began to open. A small, courageous act of trust that would change everything. The walls of her logic, built by a lifetime of hardship, came crashing down. With a resolve born not of certainty, but of sheer, staggering surrender, she turned back toward her home. The sticks in her arms felt different now. They were no longer for a final, mournful fire, but for a fire of hope. Every step was a declaration of trust, a quiet prayer whispered to the dust. She did what the man had said. She entered her small house and went to her kitchen. Her hands, trembling slightly, reached for the jar of flour. She had shaken it just an hour before, and it was empty. Yet now, as she scooped her hand inside, she felt the familiar texture of a single small handful of flour. She took it, the exact amount for a small cake. Then, she reached for the jug of oil. The last drop had already been poured out. She tipped it, and from its depths a single miraculous stream of oil trickled out, enough for her to mix with the flour. The act itself was a ritual of faith. She mixed the ingredients, kneading the tiny bit of dough with a heart that was learning a new language, the language of gratitude and awe. She baked the cake for the prophet, the man who had asked for everything. And when it was done, she brought it to him, a simple, humble offering from a heart that had been broken open. As she handed it to him, she must have felt a profound sense of emptiness, a surrender so complete it was a kind of new beginning. She had given away the last of her hope, and in that act she had made room for my provision. The shift was immediate. She returned to her kitchen, her heart heavy, ready to face the consequences. But when she looked into the jar of flour, she saw that it was not empty. There was another handful. She looked at the jug of oil, and it was not dry. There was another trickle. The shift was not a single event. It was a continuous miracle. Day after day she would go to the jar, and there would be just enough flour. Day after day she would go to the jug, and there would be just enough oil. It was a constant, living, breathing testimony to the power of a faith that gives. The feeling of relief must have been overwhelming, turning into a constant sense of awe. The anxiety that had once consumed her was replaced with a quiet, daily expectation of a God who provides. Her life was no longer defined by what she lacked, but by what He gave. She wasn't living on a reserve, she was living on a promise. And every morning, that promise was made new. The ritual of her life had changed from one of scarcity to one of faith. She woke up not to dread, but to the gentle pull of a jar and a jug that were a daily reminder of a God who had not forgotten her. The miracle was not in a one-time abundance, but in the quiet, consistent faithfulness that taught her what it meant to truly trust. This was the profound, subtle, and daily shift from scarcity to abundance. It wasn't about being rich, it was about being provided for, in a world that had forgotten how. The miracle was not just in the flour and oil, it was in the transformation of her heart. She was learning to trust, to surrender, and to live in a way that was entirely dependent on me. The very fabric of her days was rewoven with threads of grace. The daily act of receiving and the daily act of giving became a rhythm of her life, a silent conversation with her Creator. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a witness. The purpose of this miracle, my beloved, was never simply to keep a mother and her son from starving. My father could have sent manna from the heavens or a flock of ravens to bring them bread, as he did for Elijah. No, this miracle was for a far more profound and eternal reason. Her story, her act of surrender, was meant to be a living, breathing testimony to the generosity of the Father. Her purpose was not just to survive, but to be a beacon of hope in a land of despair. For when a person finds a new life, they are called to become a light to others who are still in the darkness. Her faith, small at the outset, had grown into a mountain that was a visible sign of my kingdom's reality. She became a living parable, a sermon without words for all the people in Zarephath who were still suffering. They would see her, a woman who once had nothing, now living on the unshakable foundation of my promise. Her story became a lesson for generations to come. It was a powerful, personal testament to the fact that the Father's economy operates on a different set of principles than the world's. In the world, you save your last bit. In my kingdom, you give it away. In the world, you protect your own. In my kingdom, you trust me to protect you. Her purpose was to show the world that the smallest act of faith, the most radical surrender, can unleash a torrent of my provision. She demonstrated that when you live a life of unconditional trust, you are never truly without. The jar of flour and the jug of oil were not just gifts. They were symbols of a continuous covenant, a promise that my supply is not based on your resources, but on my endless grace. She became an instrument of the Father's mission, not through wealth or power, but through a brokenness that made her perfectly ready to receive my unending provision. Her purpose was to live out the truth of the Scripture, "My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:19. Her life, once a story of quiet desperation, was now a living testament to the truth that when you give it all to me, you will never be empty. The story of her life was now one of legacy, not survival. She was living for a purpose far greater than her own immediate needs. The story of the widow of Zarephath is not just a tale from a distant past. It is a story that reaches across centuries and speaks directly to your heart, right now. The impact of her faith extends beyond her lifetime and her small town. Her story lives on as a challenge and an invitation to every single soul that feels like they are at the end. I want you to look at your life, at the one thing you are holding on to, the one handful of flour you are saving for your last meal. Perhaps it is a dream you are protecting from criticism, a hurt you refuse to let go of, a resource you are hoarding out of fear. That very thing, that last bit of control you are clinging to, is the key to unlocking a torrent of my provision in your life. Do not allow your mind to tell you that your logic is more reliable than my promise. Do not let your fear convince you that you will be without. That small act of faith, that simple gesture of trust, is a catalyst for a miracle. The jar of flour and the jug of oil were never meant to be a one-time event. They are a continuous reality for every soul that chooses to live by faith. The promise is still the same. My supply is endless. The challenge is still the same. Will you give me your last? My beloved, I know your pain. I see your weariness. I know the anxieties that keep you up at night, and I am speaking to you with the same authority and the same gentleness that I spoke to the widow. Your story is not over. The end you see is not the end that I have planned for you. Your faith, no matter how small you think it is, can move heaven. It can cause the impossible to become your new normal. The moment you give up your last bit, your last plan, your last ounce of control, is the very moment I begin to fill your life with a purpose, a joy, and a provision you could not have imagined. This is my heart for you, that you would know the unending, overflowing nature of my love and care. My provision is not for a season, but for a lifetime. My promise is not for a moment, but for eternity. Your fear is a good servant, but a terrible master. Do not let it command you any longer. The question is, are you ready to be a living, breathing testament to my provision? Are you ready to let go of your last meal so that I can fill your life with an unending feast? This is your invitation. This is your moment. Your faith has the power to move heaven. All you have to do is surrender.